Greetings and welcome to Parallel Realities Podcast. I'm Anthony Harris with Cleo Monago, and Cleo, as we always do in this program, in honor of the brilliant psychiatrist Frances Cress Welsing, do you know what's happening?
I certainly hope so. I think I do. How you doing, Anthony?
I'm doing well, thank you. As we head into a new year, same old in terms of issues involving Black people. And what we'd like to do in this first edition of the 2015 year of the PR podcast, like to kind of look at some of those things that may be hindering or impediments or distractions to Black unity. In 2014, we saw an increase, or a revitalization of the Black freedom movement, if you will, and through protests and sadly through almost everyday acts of violence and brutality perpetrated on Black people, there was a movement that started mostly from young people, and obviously from the Mike Brown murder and other murders, Eric Garner, and you can go on and on. So I'd like to have a discussion during this first edition in 2015 about those things that are stopping Black people from completely unifying, those things externally and internally. Before we get into a little bit of that, there have been some news developments since we last spoke to you. And one of them, I think, is somewhat of a bombshell, if actually accurate and true. The Eric Garner story continues. You may recall in Staten Island over the summer, he was choked to death by police officer Daniel Pantaleo. And in early December, the verdict came out with not guilty. Everyone witnessed it on tape, but unfortunately, the verdict was not guilty. I want to direct your attention to an article that I saw on the website called thefreeproject.com. They have a headline that's entitled "The Bombshell Interview, Eric Garner's Death, a Retaliatory Move by the NYPD." Basically, the gist of the article is that Eric Garner was not killed or choked or even approached by police because he was selling Lucy cigarettes. The main reason that they were saying is that Eric Garner had been harassed consistently by police in Staten Island, and you can tell from his reactions he was expressing that he was tired of it. And as a result of him filing a complaint because of those harassment events, he was targeted and harassed by the police officers. I'll read a bit from the article. As they interviewed Eric Garner's father, and what Eric Garner's father, Mr. Benjamin Carr, what he says is, "I wouldn't really say he was killed because Eric was a Black man. It's due to the fact that they stole money from him and refused to give him his money, and he filed charges against them. This is why he had a vendetta. This is why he had a vendetta against him." The article would later go on to state some more interesting observations. The Free Project group tried multiple times to confirm this complaint against the NYPD by reaching out to their Staten Island precinct. However, after being placed on hold by the NYPD for long periods of time, hung up on, and eventually ignored, we were unable to get a statement from them in regards to this case. The recordings of these calls will be put up on the website for your review. However, we did confirm with a member of Garner's family that Eric Garner was frequently harassed by these officers, and it goes much deeper than money. Garner had actually been sexually assaulted by the NYPD on multiple occasions, according to our sources. Of course, this sounds ridiculous. How would the NYPD sexually assault a man like Eric Garner, and why? But if we dig a little deeper, we see that Officer Daniel Pantaleo, the man who was responsible for Garner's death, has been sued 3 times for violating the constitutional rights of other Black males in the area by performing humiliating strip searches and fondling the genitalia of his victims, some of them in public view. Cleo, now again, this is from the Free Thought Project website, an article from December 15th, written by Matt Agarist. What are your thoughts on this?
My thoughts on it are that if any of that is true, this is pretty deep, in my opinion. I've heard before somewhere about Pantaneo, whatever his name is, fondling Black men in particular, and that he was once charged for it. I think that's a very important aspect to this case, and an important expose of how Black people are treated in this country. So I just hope this stuff is true. What I would like to see, if that was possible, is an example of the past accusations toward him that he I think he said wasn't he once sued for it, or
Yeah,
there
that's
was
what I
like
was
a
saying.
case or
Yeah,
something.
yeah. Let me read a little further. Yeah, he was sued, and one of the lawsuit victims, Rylon Walker, he was charged with marijuana possession and underwent similar rights violations by Pantaleo. When we say similar, the strip searches and all that kind of stuff. The
Yeah.
charges were dismissed against Walker and the case sealed on a motion from prosecutors. His lawsuit against the NYP stated that Walker was committing no crime at that time and was not acting in a suspicious manner. So, yeah, you are correct. And let me go back. The NYPD paid out a settlement last year, that would be 2013, to two men who sued the city because Pantaleo forced them to strip naked in public as he touched and searched their genital areas or stood by while this was done in their presence. So yes, he does has a history of that.
Yeah, man, that's upsetting and that's deep, and that should be put on Front Street. That happens. Number one, people are strip searched publicly like that, and number two, that the man did it, and he's still on the force. You know what I mean? I mean, bottom line is that what you do to black men, it's not considered. People are they're not important enough to be concerned about their human rights. So somebody can do something like that and keep their job. That's deep.
Yeah, so again, that article is from the freethoughtproject.com, written by Matt Agarist. December 15th, 2014 is the date. The headline is Bombshell Interview, Eric Garner's Death, a Retaliatory Move by the NYPD. We'll keep abreast of this. We'll check in on the website as we continue, and we'll let you know if we hear any more about it. Moving along, you may recall that about 2 weeks ago, two New York City police officers in Brooklyn were killed by a man who who rode a bus rather, from Baltimore to New York and killed them. Tragic death. Very sad to see it happen. This happened in Brooklyn, New York, and the immediate outcry was that it was an assassination, an execution. These were terms that were just blasted out in front of you, and it was a big rallying around for police officers. Yes, police officers have a dangerous job. My father was a police officer, so I'm somewhat sensitive to that. And as a result, there was a shifting of the focus. It was happening before this, but this certainly pushed it further that way from the Black Lives Matter to NYPD Lives Matter, and it was kind of a tit for tat in terms of trying to steal the public attention, in terms of moving the needle in your favor for the police officers. What were your thoughts on that whole event as the man who killed these officers, Ishmael Brinsley, ran away and was killed in the subway? They say he executed himself in the subway. So what were your thoughts on that, Cleo?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on what you just said. One of my thoughts is about the tendency to try to move the focus from Black Lives Matter to blue cops or Blue Lives Matter, and the media again doing what it does, which is always racist and dismissive of black issues, black fundamental justice issues, and again, it's not even the community or the people that were protesting that even fell for it. They stayed out there and continued to focus on Black Lives Matters, those among them who care about that. This Blue Lives Matter stuff was being pushed by the media, which is white and which tends to also want to marginalize racism as a problem and deal with it in a sensational way. So I think it's important to understand that while the media did what it does in terms of marginalizing black issues, the community that's out there never, swayed from that point and was consistent. In terms of how I feel about the brother that tried to kill his girlfriend allegedly, who I've never heard from yet, and allegedly killed those cops and allegedly committed suicide, it's hard to figure out what to think, except for that was an anomaly, if indeed it all occurred as reported. It's not something that happens all the time, and it is tragic. But one thing that's important in terms of the difference between a cop being killed and unarmed black people being killed, when a cop signs up to be a cop and wear a gun, they are putting themselves at risk voluntarily as someone who's carrying a gun and allegedly enforcing the law. The difference here is that a black person walking the streets unarmed is not volunteering to be killed, is not volunteering by having a gun and signing up for a situation that's deadly. They're just black men. You understand what I'm saying?
Sure, sure.
So I say that to be real clear about what's different here, because the media is not considering what I just said at all. They're just trying to move the needle back to white lives matter, frankly, because that's who the cops are protecting the most.
Right. One other, and it's just complete inconsistency, or maybe it's just intentional inconsistency. You may recall back in the fall, Eric Freund in Pennsylvania, just outside the Poconos in the woods in Pennsylvania, killed a police officer outside of a station, a police station in Pennsylvania, went into the woods, and he was finally found about a month later. There was no major cry, certainly not a national cry about a war on police or about an execution or an assassination. Eric Freund is a white man. And back, I believe, in the summer, Gerard and Amanda Miller out in Las Vegas went into a Walmart and killed a police officer and left a note saying that the war is on. No, eventually they were both killed, and there was no outcry from the nation or for the media or anyone saying it was an execution, it was an assassination. Oh, we got to protect our cops. Black cops' lives matter, or nothing like that. So that inconsistency, and it all. I mean, we talk about these things often here on the PR show, and it's just interesting how these things happen in front of us, and I think it's intentional, and it just plays out in a very weird way.
Well, also though, words are interesting things to use because they can have dual meanings. But you mentioned how there are these inconsistencies. From my perspective, they're consistencies. They're consistently marginalizing the kind of story that you just mentioned and sensationalizing the other issue in terms of white cops being killed. And that's consistent in terms of who the media makes matter the most in terms of their lives. They're making white lives be the most important. I mean, another issue, and there's so many that can be used to back this up, is that when a white girl or white boy is missing, there could be years long worth stories. Like, remember that girl, I forgot her name finally, that was killed years ago in the Caribbean?
Yeah.
White girl?
Yeah.
Whatever her name was. We heard about her for years. Is she still missing? Where is she? Oh my God. But we have yet in this country to this day to have a long story where there was great focus on what a tragedy it is that a black female, let alone a black male, is missing. So that's the consistency in the media to make white lives matter and be the most important lives there are.
Sure. And before we wrap up this segment and we get into our larger discussion, just want to talk about the Ezell Ford medical examiner with the announcement that his death was a homicide. Again, you may recall that not too long after the Mike Brown murder, Ezell Ford out in Los Angeles was killed by a police officer. That was hushed for a little while as much of the attention was on Ezell Ford, though the people in the LA community were protesting. The medical examiner, months later, not about a week ago, announced that the death of Ezell Ford was a homicide, and that one of the bullets had a muzzle imprint, meaning that it was from very, very close range, and that there were 3 shots, and eventually, obviously, Ezell Ford died, and that raises into question certainly what happened, although some believe that it plays into the police officer's account that there was a struggle. Well, it opens up several questions. Why wait so long to issue the autopsy? And there are members in the community who suggest things didn't happen that way.
Yeah, well, that's redundant. What I mean by redundant is I'm from Los Angeles. I'm intimately familiar with law enforcement there, as I was involved in law enforcement in Los Angeles. And hey, it's just corrupt. And like most systems in this country, a bunch of cover-ups go down. So just like what happened in Ferguson when the prosecutor became a defender of the murderer of Michael Brown, it's all corrupt. The whole system, in terms of law enforcement, among other systems in this country, is designed to have a certain outcome, which means, again, that white lives matter most and black lives matter least. And we'll fix things up the way we want them at the pace we want to do it. So, I mean, The bottom line is that the society is racist. And the reason I kind of side when saying that is because given all these blatant examples of the bias in this country and how deadly it is, some of us still don't have the emotional fortitude to admit it. And when we finally start talking about barriers to black unity, we can probably elaborate on that tendency of not having the emotional fortitude to consistently face the reality of things. Now, it might look that way with all these protests, but you and I have already talked about, and I remember giving my perspective of what's driving these protests. I don't think black lives really mattering is what's driving them. I think there's some of that in there, and I think there's definitely people involved who feel that way sincerely, but I don't think that's the overall perspective of everybody involved. And my point, real quickly, is that the society has successfully trained us to not care about black lives, but to do anything that we can to get on TV and to be relevant.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we'll get into that. We'll get into that discussion in much more detail in the remaining segments. You're listening to the Parallel Realities podcast for 2015, the very first edition. We'll be back with more in a moment. 2014 saw many protests and many black people, I guess, waking up, as some would say, as they moved to freedom and empowerment for their own lives, urged on by violence and brutality perpetrated on numerous black people. The Final Call, the Nation of Islam publication, had a very interesting editorial for the end of the year. The editorial read, "Black Lives Matter," or lives, or excuse me, the headline for the article read, "Black Lives Matter," or "Black Lives Should Matter." I'll read a bit from it, from the editorial to close out the year. It went on to say that it looks like the bad old days are back, and back with a vengeance. The truth is our future is not to be determined by others. It is to be determined by us. But what a difficult thing it is for a slave to accept that he is free, and not only free, but favored by God himself. It would go on to later say, despite slander, targeting, plots, hypocrites, and personal shortcomings, the nation stands today. And though it may appear crude to those looking from the outside, the Ark is the place of refuge for our people. We can no longer look outward for affirmation and direction. We must turn inward, declare Black Lives Matter, and follow up that cry with unprecedented efforts to unite and serve one another in 2015. So Cleo, in the remainder of this program, I'd like to talk with you about those things that you think may be impediments, may be distractions, may be stopping all black people from unifying. What are some of the things that come to mind for you?
Well, I should preface my comments with that I've been an activist since I was 16 for several decades. And I have been a focused activist regarding black people's lives and justice, mental health, and treatment all that time, and never been intoxicated or anything in my life, been fully present, both feet on the ground, a very focused observer and participant in agendas to advance the condition of black people politically, environmentally, structurally, etc. I say that because I've been watching how we do or do not respond as a people collectively all this time. And there's lots of things, some that preceded my very birth, that gets in the way of us coming together, which is the emotional and acculturated trauma symptoms of enslavement in this country, and the brainwashing process of training us over time to be protectors of white folks and to value their lives more than anybody else's lives, including our own, with us calling each other the N-word simultaneously to that mindset, which helps to fulfill the prophecy of lesser value to everybody, particularly whites. So we've been hypnotized into second guessing our worth, which second guesses our capacity to consistently fight for justice until we've actually received it. So, for example, during the famous civil rights movement, that was a very that movement in terms of black people was overseen by a white Jesus, in terms of what was in our mind and our psyche, in terms of who was going to be our savior in the midst of that process. So even while fighting for the right to have what white folks have, which is different from fighting for black humanity to be repaired, we were already damaged goods in terms of being seriously able to collectively focus on Black Lives Mattering. As a matter of fact, what mattered the most back then and even now is not Black Lives Mattering, but Black lives being able to do what white lives do. You know, drink at the water fountain, eat at restaurants, sit in front of the bus, blah blah blah, like white people get to do. We had people like Elijah Muhammad and before that Marcus Garvey, and probably others who we don't even know about, who understood the importance of the repair of the black self-concept as being a central component of our advancement. But that was successfully doused out by the murder of the likes of Malcolm, the marginalization and the Marcus Garvey was what do you call when you put out the country?
Expatriated.
Exactly. And Elijah Muhammad was marginalized, unfortunately, finally by the help of a very frustrated, crazed Malcolm X, in terms of him being so frustrated with Elijah that he told on him to the white racist press. You know, went to what he used to call the devil to tell on Elijah. These crazy things that we do because of a mental health problem that we have had because of the injury all these hundreds of years has not been addressed, admitted to, or resolved. So black people are always at risk. And also, at the risk of being redundant, there's too many of us who have not resolved the white protection tendencies that we were trained to have to the point of cellular levels at this point. We have to unlearn that white Jesus, black, the inferiority complex insanity before we can be successful as a people toward collectively fighting for justice.
One thing I'd like to share, Cleo, in terms of that interaction and just how wantonly certain words are used in public amongst some black people. I'm on the train coming home just a little bit before the ball dropping here in New York, and two brothers approach the door as they're waiting for the train to get to its stop. And they're just randomly talking freely, and the train is packed, the train is crowded. And they're just randomly talking, and they're using the N-word as if it's the word the, or a, or and. And it's just passed along, and the feeling within me was like I was cringing. As I heard, I had my headphones on, but I still could hear what they were saying, and I was just cringing because it was like, oh no. Just one of those awful feelings. So I'm just wondering, in terms of that interaction, can we be mindful? Can we be mindful of that sort of thing and stop doing that?
Well, I think what's important about your observation is that it includes the elements of what a counter formula would need to address. And what I mean by counter formula is that there's a word, the N-word, which is a defiling, dehumanizing word as it's used in the United States. There's a word being used on a perpetual basis that nobody has an analysis of. Nobody in the conversation that you observed, at least, has an analysis of. Well, part of countering that behavior is to give them an analysis. And we can do that. I mean, of course, you and I both have had conversations with people where they try to justify use of the term, which is just based on an emotional attachment and familiarity with the term that they can't imagine living without. But that can be unpacked and changed through an appropriate methodology and conversation, which you and I can talk about at some point, regarding ways of taking us out of the anti-black trance that we're in, which includes that word, which keeps us entranced. But when you raise the use of that word in its normality, one of the things that helps to change that is to abnormalize its usage, because clearly it's used very, very normally to the point of you cringing. And I imagine since you cringe over that, you probably cringe a lot.
Regrettably, yeah.
Yeah, well, I understand the cringing. And what I do as a behavior change specialist and dealing with behavioral health is when I see that kind of stuff, I address it. But I address it not by attacking them and saying, "What the hell is wrong with y'all using that word?" And I've seen that word used on the subway as well. And one of the things I've done on many occasions is smile at the brothers and come off purposely unhostile in terms of my demeanor, and say, "What's how you doing, man?" And they say, "What's up?" I said, "I noticed that you have used that word a lot, and I know that we use it a lot. But do you know where that word came from?"
Yeah.
And just that question has started conversations, and in the midst of them trying to justify using of it. But that's not the point. The point is, do you know where it came from? And most people don't. And when I tell them where it came from, slavery and being enslaved, and during a profoundly dehumanizing component of black life in the United States, somebody almost all the time will say, "Well, we've changed the meaning." And I go, "From what to what?" "Well, it's just a word." And I'll say, and I got to cuss, and I know this is not regular radio, so I'm going to have to cuss, and you can bleep me later. I'll say, "Okay, what if I called you a stupid, dumb MF?" That's just a word too. So why don't you use that word now, and call yourself stupid idiots as a part of your vocabulary, since it don't mean nothing. And almost every time I do that, they get it. Now, some of them are so enculturated into normalized use of it, they don't necessarily stop on the dime. But I know, after having seen some of these people that I've spoken to later, that it made them think. And some people, I'm glad to say, stopped using the word. Not everybody,
Right.
but some people did. And if I didn't say anything, there would have been no chance of that. But because I got them to critically look at their behavior and the context of the words that they use all the time, they second guess the use of the word as opposed to using it emboldeningly with no thought. Everything that we do, in many cases, most of us, we think we're doing the right thing. When you're brainwashed, you don't have a self-analysis. And you think that what you're doing is the right thing. Like when black people pray to a white Jesus, they're not trying to be ridiculous. They're doing what they think is right and what they think is religiously appropriate and what they think God wants. That's what they've been trained to do.
Can I ask you a
When
question?
we call each other the N-word, we're mimicking people that we love who are black who do that.
Right.
And I mean, I've been around. I'll be quick. I can say this quickly. I have been around, and so have you. Parents with babies playing with their white dolls, what the hell they're playing with, I'm talking about black children, why the parents are saying insane stuff that the children should not hear, which is defiling of black people, which is normal, a normal part of how they interact with each other, and they think they're doing what's to be done.
Right. No, I've seen it. But I don't want to make this such a trivial question I'm going to ask, or even a pointless or silly question. I mean, I'm just asking rhetorically. So don't laugh. But what's wrong with, and again, what's wrong with praying to a white Jesus? I understand it. I don't. I understand it. I get it. I follow. But if you're a good and decent person, what's wrong with praying to a white Jesus?
Well, I've never seen that. See, I've already, and let me tell you what I've never seen was a decent. I've never seen in my life, and I've actually looked for this. A black person who believes in a white Jesus, who is functional and consistently decent, and somebody with balanced mental health. I've never seen it.
Well, hold on a second.
And
I'm sorry. Let me just ask you this then.
Including my own family, but go on.
Right. What do you mean when you say praying to a white Jesus? Are you saying Christianity?
Like
because there are people who are staunch Christians, but they in their church you may not see a white Jesus. You may even see a black one. So I mean, what's your delineation?
Well, your question was about the white Jesus. Now, of course, I've seen black Jesuses and all that stuff too. But the majority of our thoughts and our concept around what Jesus looks like is a white man, because movies keep coming out. I mean, how many mainstream multi-million-dollar funded films have you seen that had a black Jesus?
None.
No such thing.
Yeah.
There's no such thing.
Right.
And that movie that Mel Gibson did, I forgot what was it called, the Beating of Christ's Ass, or what was that movie called? Or something?
I believe it was the Resurrection of Christ.
Yeah, that movie. That movie was seen by millions and millions of people.
Yeah. Yeah, it
You know, that
was.
movie was a success, and
Hmm.
black folks broke their neck to go see the ultimate God Almighty too.
Right. But in terms of a,
So the
uh, go ahead.
so my point is that the black Jesus, which I've seen as well, is relatively marginal because the media, which always shows a white Jesus, is in charge of the mindsets in this country. And one of the fundamental things that black people need to do in terms of just poking our eyes in at solutions is stop letting their children watch TV
Hmm.
and make sure that children, while being babies, are critical thinkers and don't even have any interest in watching the insult called television. So we
Well,
don't do that.
right. Well, how do you begin to do that? Because on any economic level, or I'm sorry, any economic indicator you look at, black people are at the bottom of it. So I'm not implying that because you have money, you are better off because we have millions of millionaires. But you have some families where there may be a single parent working two jobs. It may be two parents but working different hours, and the child is home by themselves. And we understand peer pressure. There's peer pressure that certainly young children faced with because what other kids in their school do, they eventually drift towards it and blah blah blah. So how do you fight? Because I mean, we often talk about Frances Cress Welsing, and I remember a speech she gave years ago. She's talking about fighting white supremacy, and you do the best you can to fight it, but it's seeping through the cracks of your window, underneath your door. It's everywhere around you. So how do you fight those things?
Well, let me make sure I understand what you just said. Bear with me. You just mentioned when I said something about behavior and what we do and what children do. Your implication was that there's a lot of working class or poor black people who use the TV as a babysitter. So, therefore, as a result of this economic circumstance, they pop their kids in front of this thing so they could be attended to or have their attention on something so they can do what they got to do.
That really
Well,
wasn't what I.
first of
That really,
all,
well, just to be correct, that really wasn't what I said. But it does lead to that. What I was talking about peer pressure in terms of what they see other children at their school do. It doesn't
right.
necessarily have to do with television. It could be just a behavior. But yeah, TV
Okay,
is
well,
TV is a certainly
well,
an indicator of that.
I listened closely, and you began your comments with the economic state. That was the beginning of your comment, and then you went
Yes.
into peer pressure.
Right.
And what I thought about when you mentioned all of that was that overall, and I've been to high school before, junior high school before. I went to elementary school from New York to L.A., and I'm not exaggerating. There are basic principles that even children can follow. Children don't come to school beating the hell out of everybody and throwing and trying to kill everybody and acting the fool. And I mean, there's exceptions to everything, but generally, kids have a certain decorum when they come to school and deal with the teacher and deal with each other. And my point is that even kids can be taught to have boundaries. We're and they practice them generally when they go to school. There's always some people acting a fool and doing stuff outside the box, but generally children are behave in ways that are based on having boundaries in terms of what you do and don't do with each other. Well, we can have counter white supremacy boundaries too, if we actually understood the importance of them when as we raise our children. I mean, we teach children how to use the toilet. We teach children how to do things that they need to know how to do to operate allegedly civilly in a society. So children can be taught to do anything if their parents have the capacity to teach them. And what we're in the vicinity of now are several generations of children or parents who are white accommodationists, who are white Jesus, parade of white Jesus, and who are protectors of white supremacy, and teach their children to not say white out loud, to whisper. If they critique racism at all, which most of us aren't even trained to do. So, regardless of the economic state, this ain't an issue of economics. As a matter of fact, some of us are poor because of low self-concept. Because even with white supremacy going on, there are other energies that can lead to outcomes where you're not impoverished, and that's a whole nother show. Because I can talk about that from personal experience. Because I came from a poor family that lived in the projects. But the point is that the issue here is a set of principles and a set of training that are white counter supremacy principles that we just don't have. I mean, for example, if we this thing called Kwanzaa is introduced to many of us in December of every year. Well, the Kujichagulia, if we did not look at it as just some temporary counter Christmas or instead of Christmas
Yeah, for 7 days.
celebration
Yeah,
stuff,
for 7 days. Yeah.
if we actually looked at them and took them seriously instead of being distracted by the white protecting tendencies we gotten through our training in this country and through the media, which you've already discussed, we will be on fire in terms of being more proactive and more unified if we paid attention to that. But we're trained successfully by the media and by the white supremacists training and through educational systems, etc., that what black people need and want is marginal and has relatively irrelevant value. And unfortunately, despite or regardless of your economic status, that's how we're trained. When we learn to admit that, which means we're going to have to get off of this white protecting, white accommodationist bag that we are, things will change for us, regardless of our economic status. Black people, because of, as we talked about before, because of years of indoctrination, look at a whole lot of insanity in an endearing way. We also look at white people who are racist and a white media in an endearing way.
Let me ask you this. As we move along. Let me ask you this. The world now, everyone is sort of connected through the technology that we have in the world. There are opportunities on the continent and in other areas throughout the diaspora where there can be connections made. But with saying that, there are also ways that you can communicate or you are interacting with everyone in the world. So with what we're talking about in terms of unity, and I hope this is not a sidebar or a distraction to that conversation, but is there a way, because when you think about it, we're going to have to deal with other people, whether we want to or not. We're going to have to deal with other people. Is there a way to navigate one side, dealing with other people, and still being affirmed in your blackness? And not, why do you laugh? Why do you laugh?
I'm laughing because it's deep to me that we go to this deep in my opinion, far-fetched consideration regarding some implication that caring about black people means human isolation. And like, for example, my nephew, who I've mentioned before, named Isaac, who's half Chinese, he's getting his Chinese affirmation on. But and it's working in a very positive way in terms of his behavior. But he's not isolated. He ain't hating nobody. He loves his dark-skinned, black, African hair having mama. Loves her to death, like most babies love their mother. He loves her like a mother loves their child.
Right.
But so him being half Chinese, and on one half of him getting this very serious and focused culture affirmation does not make him hate black people, but I know for a fact it's going to make him look at black people like they're crazy, because he's going to have the side of him.
Right. Well, who's going to be there to intervene when he grows up and perhaps sees more dysfunction and then begins to write off black people and moves into another direction? Who will be there to intervene?
That's a great question. And one of the things I think that he's going to be dealing with is the love of his mother that he has now as a baby at 6 years old, and becoming an adult and gaining some active interest and functionality.
Right. Well, right. I'm sorry. And that goes back to my question, though, because, okay, if you're solid in this, but you're still seeing, because a lot of people say, and I don't know if this is the case anymore, but a lot of people have said, once you make a certain amount of money and you grew up in the hood, the first thing you do is you get out of the hood. You get away from that, and you dismiss it and you leave it in your rearview mirror and you never look back. So there's that level of disassociation. So what happens in terms of dealing with everyone else, and like I just said, and still affirming your blackness and not running from it?
Well, hey, like I said before, I just met Isaac.
I'm not talking about just Isaac. I'm talking about.
I know, but I know what you're saying. I'm just mentioning. But Isaac is the frame of reference here, as a metaphor for the whole thing. And what would be great is if Isaac was allowed or encouraged to have a conversation about that, and that his family, which with my influence, it might happen. I mean, this is my family, and I'm gonna talk to them about this whole thing.
Right. Because
And I
that's,
and I
I'm sorry, and that's how we begin to see, as an adult, they affirm whiteness. And I'm not speaking specifically about Isaac, but though that's how things happen. You know, as they get older, they leave the black community, view black
well,
on
we,
black violence as just systematic of black people. You know, symptomatic
well,
rather of
we
black people.
Well, one of the things that we need to do, and maybe people who listen to our show can consider this, is we have to stop feeding into the normalized linguistic tendencies in a society to speak of black people in dehumanize and objectifying ways. Calling black neighborhoods hoods is a problem. I mean, it's a neighborhood. There ain't no damn hood. And hoods are something that people put on the top of their shirt to cover, to protect themselves from the rain, or get killed by George Zimmerman. That's
Right.
what hoods are.
Right.
We live in communities of people and families, and we need to start thinking of where our people are as human communities of people and families, and stop feeding into this characterization or character assassination of black everything, because that's part of why we leave and go into whiteness all full fledged in the first place.
Right. If I can, I
That's
want
part of that's part of,
to. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm
that's
sorry.
part of that's part of the formula for change.
If I can, in a little bit of time we have left in this segment, I want to read something else from this editorial in the final call in terms of Black Lives Matter, or Black Lives Should Matter. It says, "We are a people who have been turned upside down and inside out. Today we can be
Yep.
our own worst enemies through our
Yep.
outright attacks on one another, our willingness to
Yep.
target and betray one another at the order of our oppressors, and our actions
Yep.
that spring from the deeply rooted disease of self-hatred."
Yep.
Yeah, there's a lot to deal there, and it is encouraging to see the Black Lives Matter hashtag and the protests, and I hope it continues, and I hope it evolves as we move along.
Well, it is encouraging, but I'm not as hopeful as you are. And I got to preface my comments with I know for a fact that there's solutions to what we're dealing with, but I'm not hopeful because what that article just got finished saying, and what I've talked about all the time are the layers, and the layers. There should be a movie called Layers Matters, because the layers are deep and important, and they ain't talking about them. So therefore, we at risk to relapse and go back to the same old crap, because you have to thoroughly unpack a phenomena to be less at risk to that phenomena. Until we have a Black Lives Matter, as well as a Layers Matter, and reparations matters, and black repair of self-concept matters, until all that is mattering simultaneously, we're going to relapse
Right, right, right,
back into normalized white supremacy.
right. What are some you often talk about this, where people mask or put a nice look on self-hatred? What are some examples of those?
Blonde weaves. It's not a nice look to me, but people pay a lot of money to wear that. A lot of things we do. Our bravado. A lot of brothers went around in hardcore black male drag with all this hip hop bravado and all this kind of stuff. These are ways of adding rhythm to dysfunction, to adding what looks like vibrancy and cultural expression to dysfunction. You hear rappers talk about the N word and bitch and hoe and all this other stuff that we do. We make self hatred look good. We make we make it look so
I don't mean
good
to laugh.
that
Yeah.
we have people like Marky Mark, who we talked about before with the Funky Bunch. It was hard for me to say without laughing. But we have people like Marky Mark, and other white folks trying to copy black youth bravado, finesse, and culture while they're children, before they grow up and become full-fledged white men like Marky Mark did, or Mark Wahlberg did. We are a people of great dimension and majesty and magic around a great scar that came from our oppression in this country. So we make a lot of crazy stuff look good all
Mm.
the time. We're the best. We're the best athletes overall.
Right.
Which clearly, when there's a black pattern, the result of the black experience.
Right.
But then these people bring their black genius into the arms of a white pimp and are silenced and become jocks for a white pimp and never ever attend to blackness again, not unless it becomes politically correct and they throw on a t-shirt for 5 minutes and take it off when it's time to take it off. And that's whenever white people tell them to.
Mm-hmm. You're listening to the Parallel Realities Podcast, Truth from the Other Side. Black Lives Matter or Black Lives Should Matter, an editorial from the Final Call closing out the 2014 year, and we're discussing the impediments to black unity. Just read a bit from the article as I thought it was enlightening and very interesting. Black Lives Matter, or perhaps Black Lives Should Matter, and Black Lives should matter most to black people. That means that whether the issue is lives lost at the hands of police, officers who see themselves as an occupying force when it comes to black neighborhoods, or the fratricidal violence that causes thousands of deaths each year, black people should be at the forefront of not only protesting the loss of life, but working ceaselessly to avoid the loss of black life. So that leads us to another often discussed topic, and that is black on black violence. Many people know about what's been going on in Chicago and the gang violence and just random acts of violence and the statistics many people cite. What are your thoughts on that? And not per se, I really don't want to get into the discussion on black violence and white on white violence. No, just the fact that based on what we just discussed and how black people should interact with each other and some of the things you just talked about in the last segment, what things can be done to stop black people from killing each other or conflict within black people?
Attending to the exact same things I just got finished talking about. One of the mantras in our community and in families across the country that's unconscious but prevalent, and I've seen it again with myself all the time, is the impulse to say when disappointed by somebody black that niggas ain't shit. That is a mantra that's used all the time, everywhere, perpetually among black people, regardless of class. That mantra has done so much damage to black people, which implies that we're not even worth feces. We're lower than that in value. How are you going to value the lives of people that you have an unconscious perspective, and in some cases, conscious perspective like that? So us killing each other is a logical outcome of, among other things, having that conscious or unconscious perspective of black people. And believe me, we have that perspective. I hear it all the time from all kinds of black people, just saying it in passing. And again, children are there because we're so unconsciously anti-black as a people, because we live in the United States, which is anti-black, that it leads to what you just got finished talking about, among other things: us killing each other, us dismissing each other, us destroying each other, us not unifying and coming together. And the thing that I want our audience to understand is that the mantra is a myth. The mantra is based on being trained to hate ourselves during the slavery process, and we have no lesser value than anybody else. We're just as valuable as any other human being, to say the least. And given that we're the first people who've been here so long, we have particularly investment in humanity because we helped to create humanity.
Well,
we don't know that.
Yeah, let me ask you this then. Why is it that, because in just basic human relationships, there's going to be disappointment. There will be sadness, and people are going to do things that are going to make you unhappy. That's just basic human interaction. Why is it that when black people do that to each other, it's magnified and it's viewed as NAS, as you just said, or there's such hostility towards it in those responses? And again, I'm not saying that other nationalities don't act out in anger towards each other, but it appears to be that when black people do something wrong to each other, there's an added anger or stuff that comes with it.
Well, I think there's multiple factors. One is that this society is anti-black. The media, which is the most influential thing in this country, is anti-black and racist. So, and then we talk about many generations of people being born into this anti-black soup called the Western world / United States. So, in an anti-black context, what black people do that could be perceived as negative is magnified. And you already mentioned earlier in this show about how when these black cops were killed, etc., there was no fanfare.
No, the white cops.
When white,
The white cops were killed. Yeah, the white cops were killed by the man in Brooklyn.
right. Well, the bottom line is that there was no big focus on that they were that cops matter and blah 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 blah.
Right.
Only to marginalize the perpetual mantra that defies the media and racism. I was saying Black Lives Matter. So I think I made that point.
Right.
So we live in the white Jesus. We can go on and on. All the target group in all this crap is, in terms of the affirmation, is the affirmation of white folks. The target group in terms of marginalization and dehumanization and having lesser value in terms of implication is black people. I mean, for example, we talked earlier about I couldn't think of that white girl's name. Her name was Natalie Holloway. I figured it out. That got lost in the Caribbean, and we heard about it for years, about the poor girl being missing. And then there's people like Felicia Barnes and so many black people who are missing, and nobody hears about it at all. Everything implies that we should fight each other, that we should hurt each other, and that we have lesser value. So this is what you're talking about, is simply the outcome of a system of practice, mm-hmm. not a genetic deficiency on our part. We live in a society that's deficient when it comes to being consistent around human beings. Even when the Declaration of Independence and the constitutions were created, we were 3/5 of a human being.
Yeah. Let me ask you this then. Why the distrust amongst black people? Because all people are diverse, and yes, even black people are diverse, come in many different forms. So why is there the element of distrust, and why just aren't people accepting of who people are? Because I think I had a discussion a while back. A relative of someone was saying that I always speak to my people when I see them. And then they said, sometimes they look at me like I'm crazy and they don't say nothing. And I thought about that for a moment. I said, and this is just me expressing, I said to them, that may be because black people don't trust people, that they don't trust each other. And they may think that your hello may be an invitation to mess with them or to interrogate their lives. It's something as simple and as innocuous as a hello. There may be a discomfort there. So why is there the element of distrust, or there's that discomfort there within black people?
Well, we're almost having a circular discussion in terms of the source of this. Black people are trained to protect whiteness at all costs.
But I understand. I don't mean to cut you off. I understand that, and I think you're right. We probably are having a circular discussion. But what does whiteness have to do with two black people saying hello to each other, or one trying to say hello to the other?
I'm one, and my friends have teased me for this, and some of them have transformed in some cases, fortunately, as a result of my explanation. But I'm one of those black people that always speaks to other black people, and has experienced, some of them look at me like I'm crazy. Most of them, which I think is important for people to hear, looking relieved and glad and appreciative of the greeting, and that's what happens in most cases. But if I didn't greet them, they would not have greeted me. So there was a cynical expectation or behavioral impulse to not speak. I think that when you live in society that's where you're black in it, and the perpetual narrative that hits your psyche is that you have no value, and black men in particular have no value, who are always being incarcerated, always doing something wrong, always being criminal, always up to no good. And then black people over generations, in too many cases, act that expectation out because they're treated like that's how they should be, is a vicious cycle of anti-blackness.
Mm.
And there's all and also what I mean by the whiteness part is that when I was young, when we moved to new neighborhoods and they were always black, somebody brought us a cake. Our children played together. I played with other children. That don't happen no more. There are no. They're very. I live in a black neighborhood. I have a home in a black neighborhood right now. That's all black, and nobody comes outside to play, grease each other. The children don't play in the street. Everybody's looking at each other with suspicion.
Word up. That's
That's the
true.
side effect. That's a side effect of whiteness being more important than everybody else, and whiteness being the goal. When whiteness is your goal and you're black, you're anti-black,
Right. I
and
agree.
your behavior is going to indicate that.
Right. I agree with you completely on that. I remember when I was growing up, I grew up in a black neighborhood in Harlem. And man, you would go out and you just play. It'd be no big deal. You
Yeah.
you don't see that anymore. They're walking the streets. That's what young people are
Yep.
doing now. They're walking the streets looking to do stuff. And but again, I just find it somewhat interesting that what part does education play in that? Because it seems as though you're saying that parents are going to have to educate their children outside of the school system. There's going to have to be a strong parents or other adults in their lives, in the children's lives, are going to have to do some serious educating outside of the school system. You know how everyone talks about this discussion that parents have with their black male sons about dealing with the police. It seems like there's going to have to be much more to that discussion, much more of a historical context and perspective placed on that discussion for all black children.
Well, this past holiday season, as they call it in this country, I was in the Bay Area visiting my father's family. And among the many interesting things that I experienced, beyond the issue of just family love, but the casual, normalized, dysfunctional black stuff that I always see, I have a little step nephew named Isaac. Isaac is 6 years old. Isaac has a Chinese father, and my niece is his mother, who's black. Now, I never met Isaac before until this year when I went to the Bay Area to hang out with my father's family. Isaac is very interesting because Isaac is half Chinese and half black, and his Chinese father, that's a whole long another story, is incarcerated, but somehow he lives with his Chinese grandparents, and that's where he spends most of his time,
Hmm.
and he spends at 1 to 2 days a week. I'm not sure how consistent it is, but he spends 1 to 2 days a week with his mother. But most of his time is spent with his Chinese grandparents. And he goes to Chinese school. And he's trained to learn Chinese and Chinese culture and to value on a holistic level or dimensional level his Chinese heritage. Now, it's very interesting watching Isaac, and I have another nephew who's in the same age bracket. Well, I won't say his name. I already said Isaac's name, and I won't say his name because his situation is more dysfunctional. He too has a father. His father's also incarcerated, and he, who's black, my other nephew, who has two black parents, though one of them is missing, is has way more behavioral problems. And what this gets back to in terms of what we previously talked about was preparing our children. Isaac, who's only 1 year older than the other child, is always his equilibrium and his behavior is always balanced, even when he's facing chaos. And trust me, he's facing black folks, so he's facing chaos. When he is in the presence of chaos, he's always consistently calm and focused and observing as opposed to participating and mimicking the dysfunction. And so my point of raising that is that what keeps him in that state of balance, no matter what. I mean, I watched this for 4 days. It's that Chinese cultural, consistent clarity and preparation to be in the world as a child of Chinese descent with focused Chinese parents. And of course, I didn't even know I was going to witnessed this because I didn't even know Isaac existed until I got to my family in the Bay Area. So it shows you what you can do with children if you have the luxury of not dealing with cultural disruption and having to be constantly at risk of a institutional attack on you being your only frame of reference.
Right, right. Let me ask you this, in the little bit of time we have in this segment. You talked about cultural affirmation, I guess what you're saying there. Now I mean, you in the beginning you talked about Marcus Garvey, Malcolm X, Elijah Muhammad. You talked about a litany. Well, there's a litany of people that we have that you don't have to go too far back to call upon. So why can't there be in black families a retrieval or a Sankofa, if you will, a retrieval of that legacy or of that movement?
Well, I have to preface my comments with that every single problem that black people have is 100% resolvable. All of it. If we did what a practice that I developed called critical thinking and culture affirmation as a collective people, we'd be fine in a month or less and be able to take care of ourselves and be more sane. But so I want to, before I get into the depressing facts, I have to preface it with the encouraging fact that this is all changeable. But the difference between black history in this country, and you mentioned Elijah Muhammad and all this other kind of stuff, is that all those people are under attack. Chinese people and Chinese culture is not under attack. Chinese people and Asian people come to this country all the time and extend and affirm or build Chinatowns and Japanese towns and banks, the Bank of Suzuki and whatever it's called, all the time. They're not under attack, and they're not culturally compromised by enslavement in the United States. They don't have those conditions to unlearn and to come out of. They're just Chinese and know their last names. My nephew knows his last name, not no slave name like most of us have. So there's an injury that black people have learned to live around instead of resolve, to get our hair weaved around, to buy a car that we can't afford around, to go in debt to keep with the Joneses around, to be dysfunctional around, as opposed to dealing with it, resolving it, so our children won't be subject to it anymore. We're into trying to keep up with the Joneses, who are white in metaphor, instead of being repaired as a people. Chinese don't got to go through no reparations process in terms of their self-concept. And that's why my little nephew, who's half Chinese, can just cruise on through dysfunction and chill. Everybody else is all involved in the dysfunction.
Right. We're discussing
it can be resolved, but we got to admit what I just got finished saying first.
Right. We're discussing the impediments to black unity here in 2015. You're listening to the Parallel Realities Podcast, Truth from the Other Side. "2015, can black people unify?" And we're discussing that. Here in this last segment, I would like to bring up a topic where we're discussing one area that may come off as an impediment to black unity, and that is homosexuality. Here in the last year, and certainly the last few years, we've witnessed an acceptance in terms of homosexuality in the mainstream world. We've seen many people come out, many black people come out, and athletes, in fact. Once the place where you'd never expect a black athlete, let alone to come out, we've seen several come out as homosexual. But there still are some elements of homophobia. So what do you think, Cleo? Do you think that homosexuality is a problem in terms of unifying black people?
Well, I don't think And I think we've talked about this before, but I don't think homophobia is a proper word or a dimensional enough word to describe black people's anti-homosexual attitudes or behavior. Homophobia is more appropriate when you're talking about white folks or any group that has less of a dimensional or layered of issues than we have. Some of the reaction to so-called homosexuality in the black community is a reaction to concern, whether it's conscious or not. In some instances, it is conscious. It's react to concern about the compromise of black people or the injury to black people over time resulting from oppression in this country, and a concern about black men not being men. When white folks say homophobia, they ain't going through all of that because white men have gotten the opportunity to be so-called men in this society because they created it, including homosexual men like J. Edgar Hoover, who was one of the most powerful men in this country and who wore a dress when he went on occasion. But black men have not had opportunity undisrupted to just be human beings, let alone men based on a patriarchal construct that we live in. So part of what's going on in terms of homosexuality based on King James and the right-wing anti-homosexual perspective, which runs anti-homosexual attitudes in the world, this black people got more stuff going on. But that an anxiety that we have around the compromise of black men, because most of the focus against homosexuality is on men, not that much on women. Even Dr. Welsing, who is a woman, when she focused on homosexuality as a problem in her ISIS paper book, she talked about men exclusively. And that's who we're concerned about. So given the concern about the compromise of black men that we have that distracts us from just getting busy as a people, homosexuality does create a distraction that's an impediment to black focus on unity and cooperation. Absolutely.
Right. Well, are there any, is it, in this world that we certainly have right now, is it possible for a homosexual black person, black man, black woman, to still be unifying, to still be seen by the overwhelming majority of black people as that's just an area of their life? That's not completely how we view them because that person is in our community, helping our community. Is that possible, or does that person exist?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's to see white folks keep running everything and they love to highlight black conflicts, but there's always been and always will be and still are people in the black community who aren't hung up on same-gender loving people, who, despite being conditioned to trip off of like everybody else, have gotten over it or never fell for it, and who don't even have no issues with same-gender loving people, even as far back as James Baldwin and others. There's always been a noticeable number of black people who weren't hung up and reactionary to the existence of the family members who are same-gender loving. So, as a matter of fact, there have been studies done, including by the Kaiser Family Foundation, that indicated that black people were less anti-homosexual than, for example, white folks. So that's not everybody is hung up, but the context for a lot of these hang-ups again come from the religious aspect, mimicking the anti-homosexual perspectives put into the white Bible.
Right.
And you got black men who are humiliated around their own masculinity and manhood, who react to homosexuality. And you got the other problem, which we've discussed very little, which is there's molestation going on in our community between men and little girls, to a lesser extent between women and little boys, but it occurs, and between boys and men. And the lack of conversation about that phenomena, there's a lot of traumatized and abused adults who are abused homosexually, who have some resentment about that and look at all homosexuals as potential predators because they were victims. And there's been no functional or constructive resolution or addressing of that phenomena that festers into what looks like so-called homophobia, when it's really a logical reaction to having been abused and traumatized unaddressed.
Right, right. You and I have talked about this quite a bit. Are there any black homosexual relationships that are displayed in mainstream media before us?
No. And also I got to say that there's almost no, not unless it's in a comedy, um, heterosexual black relationships in media either
That's true.
that
Yeah.
that positively show and demonstratively uncut, undeniable, passionate love between black people. Period.
Right.
I mean, even in the high profile show that we just talked about in other shows called Murder, some about with Viola Davis, something about murder.
How to get away
How to
with
get
murder? Yeah.
she had a white husband,
Yeah.
and most of the black people in high profile shows, including Don Cheadle on the Showtime series, we can go on. White folks have made sure that the black person has a white partner.
Right. Is there now? There have you and I have discussed in previous shows too the number of homosexual inter mixed relations, mixed relationships rather. We identified it in great detail in great detail in the previous show. What does that have? What effect does that have on the black psyche? Does it further destroy or harm the black psyche, even if they want to be, even if some people who may have considered themselves on the fence or didn't like homosexuality and they were beginning to try to understand it, and then they see on television a football player kissing his white partner because he's been drafted, and they see that, and what effect does that? And they see no counter to that anywhere. What effect does that have on the black psyche?
Well, you may be too young to have heard of this. I don't know, but there was a film when I was a very young child that came out that starred Della Reese and Red Fox called Norman, Is That You? Yeah, have you ever heard of that?
I've heard of the film, yeah.
Well, Norman, Is That You? These black parents had a black same gender loving male child, and the same gender loving male child had a white partner. There was also a show that came on TV called Rock or The Rock or something. That was a short lived black situation comedy called Rock or something. And of all people, Richard Roundtree, who used to be the poster child for manhood in the 70s and 60s, I think it was the 70s, as Shaft, played a homosexual on this show called Rock, and his partner was white. Mm-hmm. There used to be a show called In Living Color that had Antoine and Blaine,
yeah,
that you may remember. I know you're old enough to remember that.
Yeah, yeah.
And Antoine and Blaine did a skit as two flamboyant homosexuals, and when they had a male partner or a male person to play with, it was a muscle-bound white boy. So the point I'm trying to make to you is that the media has always perpetuated black homosexual men with a white partner, and that's caused some angst in the black community for decades. And now you got, because white people control all of this, because there are black people who have black partners. I know a few. I've had black partners. You know, all of my long-term relationships have been with somebody black. Despite the existence of same-gender loving black couples, all white people feature on TV are black people with white partners, from Wanda Sykes to Michael Sams to Jason Collins to Don Lemon, all of them. So of course, and you've heard me say before, there's no such thing as an accidental pattern. Patterns don't have accidents, or else it's not an accident anymore. So when they show all these patterns of black same-gender loving people, white people, of course, this agenda creates a perspective among black people that makes it look like we just aping white folks, and we are what we are, resulting from white people's influence. So of course it causes that perspective. I mean, the media tells our story.
Right.
The media determines our perspective.
Sure, it's very interesting though, because now there's trying to be this universal acceptance of homosexuality. It's pushed before us. I mean, as a matter of fact, several states have legalized same-sex marriage. So people are trying to become more open to it, but there's very little discussion about that. I mean, about what we're talking about.
But I don't think that's true, though, Anthony.
Okay, why not?
I don't think that's true. That black people are more open to it, or that there's been a successful focus on black people in particular being more open to it. What I think is potentially being perceived here or interpreted is the power of the prowess of white gays or gays, because I consider gay to be white folks, not black people. That's a whole nother topic. Black people are homosexual, but the gay identity came from white folks. But no, what we're looking at is the success of political organizing, political relentlessness, and fulfilling a political agenda and staying on task until it's done, which is what it'd be great if black people did that for black folks. But the white power structure or the gay power structure is white, and they're taking advantage of being white and pushing for what they want and having success across the country. That does not mean, and a lot of people confuse this. People are confusing white male or white homosexual political success with homosexual acceptance. And I don't think they're necessarily the same thing. I think that the black community, where there is anti-homosexual sentiments, they're still there. I think that when the black community did support or act like it supported homosexuality, they were supporting Obama, who supported homosexuality. And black people have been enamored with having this allegedly black president, that we've been so fixed on having that be there and supporting that phenomena that almost everything that Obama has said to us, we've signed on to support him. That's not the same thing as accepting homosexuality, because the angst of homosexuality among blacks goes back to that manhood, black male compromise concerning anxiety that's alive and well and still there among black folks. Now it becomes politically incorrect now, in some instances, to be publicly defacing or critical of black folks. I mean, Roland Martin, who in my opinion was not even being anti-homosexual, was accused of that, and that accusation is still shadowing him, even though it's not even true in my opinion.
Yeah, well, you and I discussed the Tracy Morgan incident a few years back, Kobe Bryant, when he made a reference to that as well. Let me ask you this though, and you may recall in one of the earlier shows that we did, I told the audience, and we talked about an incident that I witnessed here in Harlem, where two white men were kissing publicly, and two black people referenced the fact. And in the discussion, you and I talked about whether that could happen in terms of two black men, in that case, openly expressing intimacy to one another. And your whole take on it was that it wouldn't be likely. Why? That's interesting that would happen, or you also said that you hardly even see it. There may be a slight holding of the hands or something like that, and you talked about being in Atlanta and not really witnessing that. Are black people ready for something like that?
Well, what I also said, and I'll get to your question directly, is that you hardly ever see demonstratively and consistently heterosexual black people in the middle of the street loving each other either. But the reason that you don't see same-gender loving men in the streets doing what these white folks is doing is because it's not necessarily the issue of black people overall not being ready for it. A lot of same-gender loving black folks aren't ready for it. Because of internalized oppression, internalized self-consciousness, and in some instances, internalized questioning of the value of their love and their relationships, parallel to the value of being black, which is unconscious these days, because nobody admits that. So there's more going on with black folks, as usual, than with white folks along these lines, which creates some complexity. But some black same-gender loving men, and this is too much to get into real quickly, so I won't, so it might be a tease, but a lot of same-gender loving black men hide their relationships from each other, let alone going out in the street trying to put it on display, because of a lot of distrust among each other around their capacity to keep their man in the midst of sharks. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole nother topic that nobody talks about, and that you probably never heard of, and a lot of same-gender people listen to this conversation will be shocked to hear it being talked about in the open. You know, oppression is an MF.
Right. Well, that may certainly lead to the influx or the steady increase of HIV in black community.
Oh, well, see, there you go again, bringing up something that I think is relevant, but layered and got all kinds of stuff to it that we should make a show about,
Right.
because we can do some damage
Mm-hmm.
by not telling the whole story.
Right.
And yes, to be quick, low self concept, the questioning of one's worth, the invisibility and marginalization of same gender loving people, which implies a lack of value, definitely has an impact on the capacity to have an impulse to save yourself from HIV and not among same gender loving black men. Absolutely.
Right. Lastly, we have a little bit of time here. Um, there were also some, in terms, we're talking about unifying in terms of black people. In this particular segment, we're discussing homosexuality. And now there were some transgender deaths in 2014. Here in Harlem, there was Islan Nettles was killed, and there was a big rally in terms of that, and there have been several others and I'm talking about black transgender deaths. And no real, I mean, again, there were protests, there was rallies, but no real movement in terms of that. What does that say to you? It's not much different. It's a black life dying, and the mainstream could really care less about it. So how can the black community, as we're trying to do in these protests over the onslaught of police brutality throughout the country, what can the black community do? And we're trying to unify. What can the black community do to make that stop happening?
Well, this might be controversial, my response, but you asked. Black people are being killed all the time in this country. Matter of fact, generally, they're not transgendered. So the people being killed is a horrible thing, and we should focus on that. But I don't want to take transgendered black people out of the category of black people who get killed all the time. Black heterosexual biological black women get killed all the time, and we know about black men getting killed and murdered all the time. So black people being murdered and killed generally does not make the press, because black lives do not matter in this society. And also, among these transgender people being killed, in some cases, they're being killed by peers. You know, somebody else transgendered or another same gender loving person. And the reason I say another same gender loving person is because a lot of people, including among same gender loving people and heterosexual people, look at transgendered male to female people as men in a dress. So, and not only are they seen as men in a dress, that they are men in a dress in terms of perspective, they are considered disposable relative to everybody else who's quote unquote so-called normal. And I'm putting that in quotes because I don't necessarily believe that normalcy has a particular clothing style. But the perspective here that I'm trying to raise is that black lives across the board are not mattering. Transgendered people there is some exacerbation because of the whole concern about the defiling and disruption and disfiguring of manhood among black people, which is where a lot of anti-homosexual perspectives lie. And it's a mixed bag, you know, based on everything I just got finished saying. The bottom line is that we should not, as black people, be dismissive or uncaring of anybody being killed. That's not a murderer or hurting anyone. And in these cases, these transgender people and others, black folks who are being killed, particularly by law enforcement, et cetera, are not deserving of that outcome.
Right, right. Yeah, definitely. Those were, since we were talking about homosexuality, and those were some of the, especially here in New York, it's been discussed quite a bit, and being here in Harlem, that's something that I'm familiar with. Islan Nettles was killed in 2014. In the bit of time we have here, I just want to talk about, and this may not be an area of strength for you, but I just want to talk about athletics, and only in the sense that in 2014 we saw black athletes supposedly or apparently taking a stand on issues, the I Can't Breathe t-shirts, and things along those lines. What was your thought on that? And is that something whereas athletes and entertainers who are supposed to be prominent members of our community because of the area of expertise that they have and how prominently they are displayed, and certainly the money that they make, they are supposedly important figures in our community. What did you think of them taking a stand, some of them taking a stand, and how that can be a unifying part of Black Lives Matter?
You're talking about these athletes who wore these shirts?
Yeah, the athletes who wore the T-shirts, athletes who showed who took some type of stand. There were athletes who, the football players with the St. Louis Rams, who had their arms held up. Other athletes doing things like that, and as Black people unifying in some way.
Yeah, well, hey. I hope we end the show on something positive. Let me say that. But I say that because what I'm getting ready to say is not that positive. I am not impressed with that. I would be impressed if they kept on doing it and always did it. In terms of always spoke to the importance of Black Lives Matter. Like, do they still have the shirts on?
Not since as a matter of fact, since the death of the two police officers in New York, I've not seen any. And as a matter of fact, and some football players, and they were not all Black, but some football players wore T-shirts before their games that said peace. Now all of them weren't Black, but some did, and their T-shirts said peace.
Well, see, I didn't even know that because I don't pay attention to sports as much as you do, but that's what I figured, and that's why I'm not impressed. Because clearly, putting that Black Lives Matter or I can breathe, I can't breathe, whatever it is, taking it off and on, it's based on media influence and what's the popular issue of the day as opposed to Black Lives Mattering 24/7. And a lot of these brothers who are in these football teams and stuff like that have been bought and paid for, brainwashed and caught up in their jock culture where jock lives are mattering, and are not active advocates for Black people in any kind of explicit way at all. Matter of fact, you got people like Kobe Bryant who chases white people like crack, who is always dismissing that there's racism in the world. Would you laugh at that? Then you got Charles Barkley who clearly is on crack, constantly has a new career, went from basketball to white ass kissing. So no, I'm not impressed.
Well, you said you wanted to end on a good note. In that very same vein, Azealia Banks, she's someone who has been pretty clear on how she feels about things, and you may recall we talked about her, I believe, a week ago in terms of her calling out Iggy Azalea, the Australian rapper, in terms of her reluctance to support Black Lives Mattering or Black people dying. and also Azealia Banks tweeted out recently the need for reparations, and also tweeted a link to the expose that Ta-Nehisi Coates penned in 2014 about the need for reparations. What are your thoughts on her? She's a young Black sister, 23 years old. She's someone who is not afraid to speak, and also can be a unifying figure when you think about her in the rap industry.
Well, as you know, we've already discussed Azealia, and I'm impressed with her clarity regarding Black struggle, which clearly came from her mother, which I heard her reference in a recent interview. But yeah, I mean, hey, of course I agree with her regarding the importance of talk about reparations, and I think that Ta-Nehisi Coates is a genius, and I gleaned through his comprehensive breakdown on why we should be getting reparations. And of course, I support the idea of resurfacing that article. So yeah, I'm down with Azealia, and I hope she stays consistent and don't act like these jocks. And all of a sudden, based on trends, stop talking about these issues.
Yeah, she's received some heat. I mean, just from reading the Twitter.
Of course.
Yeah, the responses on Twitter in reference to what she said, it's vile. It's like crazy. But the sad thing about it, there just can't, I would like for there to be a discussion. How about just a discussion on it? A rational human discussion without the name calling and the dismissive nature of what someone says. It's unfortunate there just can't be a discussion on that.
Yeah, well, it's unfortunate that right now we can't get past, I'm talking about black people, our intergenerational, multi-century training to be white accommodationists and anti-black. And it's that kind of sentiment that drives any attack on Azalea. Because why would a black person in particular attack a young, beautiful, brilliant, clear young sister who is an advocate for black progress? If anybody black, and it's a lot of them, because of the campaign against black power is so long and consistent, there's a lot of black people who jump defensive and lose their minds in the face of a black person talking about the advancement of black conditioning and black people because they're white accommodationists. We've been trained to be that way. We don't even know our last names.
Right.
As people of African descent.
Right. Okay, well that wraps up this edition of the Parallel Realities podcast. If you have any comments or you want to respond to anything we've said, please email us at parallelrealitiespodcast@gmail.com. You can like us on Facebook and you can follow us on Twitter at Parallel Wheel. That's at Parallel Wheel. Cleo, any final comments?
Well, as usual, good talking to you. I hope that our conversation makes sense for our listeners and that they continue to listen.
Certainly, and above it all, even if you don't agree with us, hopefully it opens up the opportunity for you to critically analyze things in your life and the world in general. We appreciate you listening and thank you for joining.
Ashe.